Welcome. Please prepare for departure. We hope you have a safe and delightful journey ahead. Thank you.
Kill, 2024. Analyses and explanations of the entire film. Director Nikhil Nagesh crafts an action thriller that transcends typical genre boundaries, operating as both a visceral survival story and a philosophical inquiry into the nature of retribution. Set almost entirely on an overnight express train traveling from Ranchi to New Delhi, the film transforms a confined corridor into a pressure cooker where the distinction between law enforcement and criminality gradually dissolves into a unified landscape of trauma and bloodshed. The narrative follows NSG Commando Amrit Rathod, who boards the Rajani Express to prevent the love of his life from entering an arranged marriage, only to find himself confronting an army of machete-wielding dacoits who hijack the train with catastrophic consequences for everyone aboard. The production operates with a deliberate narrative architecture that withholds its true nature until the moment of irrevocable loss. The initial 30 minutes present what appears to be a romantic drama punctuated by family tension, with Amrit sneaking onto the train with his fellow commando Varesh in a desperate attempt to convince Talika Singh to reject her father's arranged marriage plans and choose love instead. Cinematographer Rafi Mahmood captures these early scenes with warm, almost nostalgic lighting that recalls classic Bollywood romance, making the subsequent descent into ultraviolence all the more disorienting. The film lulls viewers into a false sense of security, establishing emotional stakes and character relationships before systematically dismantling every expectation the audience might hold about where this journey is heading. The feature film debut of leading man Lakshya represents a significant casting gamble that pays off through sheer physical commitment and emotional vulnerability. As Amrit Rathod, Lakshya embodies the transformation from disciplined soldier to grief-maddened avenger through minute changes in posture, breathing patterns, and the gradual deadening behind his eyes that signals the death of his humanity. The actor reportedly trained for 8 months in martial arts, military combat techniques, and weapons handling to achieve the authenticity required for the punishing action choreography designed by Oh Se-young. What makes the performance truly remarkable is how Lakshya communicates Amrit's internal devastation not through dialogue, but through physical exhaustion, each subsequent fight sequence leaving him more battered, more desperate, and more terrifyingly efficient at dealing death. Raghav Juyal arrives as Fani, the charismatic and utterly remorseless gang leader, whose theatrical sadism provides the film with its most unsettling presence. Known primarily as a dancer and television host before this role, Juyal completely reinvents himself as a villain who treats violence as performance art, delivering threats with a smile and murder with casual disinterest. His character Fani represents the younger generation of the bandit family, one that has abandoned the old codes of dacoity in favor of pure nihilistic cruelty. Juyal's ability to switch between childlike petulance and cold-blooded execution creates a villain who is simultaneously pathetic and terrifying. A man-child with a machete and absolutely no understanding of consequences beyond his immediate gratification. A striking structural device has become one of the most discussed elements of the film's construction: the delayed title card. For approximately 40 minutes, the narrative proceeds without revealing its name, allowing the story to function as a straightforward thriller about a soldier trying to protect his beloved and her family from armed robbers. Amrit fights defensively during this period, disabling opponents without killing them, maintaining the moral high ground expected of a trained military professional. When Fani murders Talika in a moment of shocking cruelty, stabbing her and throwing her body from the speeding train, the title finally erupts onto the screen in bold letters, signaling that every restraint has been abandoned and the audience is now watching something far more primal than a rescue mission. Oh Se-young, the Korean action choreographer renowned for his work on Snowpiercer and The Villainous, brings a distinctly bone-crunching realism to every combat sequence. Unlike the physics-defying action typical of mainstream Indian cinema, the fights in this film feel exhausting, painful, and terrifyingly grounded in the limitations of human bodies confined within narrow train carriages. Combatants stumble, slip on blood-slicked floors, and grapple desperately for improvised weapons in a manner that recalls the raw desperation of real violence rather than choreographed spectacle. The confined geography of the Rajani Express forces creative brutality, with Amrit weaponizing everything from fire extinguishers and privacy curtains to toilet fixtures and lighter fluid as the body count escalates. Director Nikhil Nagesh drew inspiration from a real-life train robbery he personally experienced in 1995, transforming personal trauma into cinematic catharsis through exaggerated violence and heightened stakes. That autobiographical element lends an authentic texture to the chaos, particularly in the early robbery sequences where the bandits' initial professionalism gradually disintegrates into panicked brutality as the situation spirals beyond their control. Bhatt understands the specific terror of being trapped in a moving vehicle with armed men, the impossibility of escape, and the way ordinary spaces like sleeper compartments and dining cars become arenas of life-or-death struggle when civilization's thin veneer is stripped away. The sound design deserves particular attention for its crucial role in building the film's atmosphere of relentless dread. Composer Ketan Sodha creates a score that functions less as traditional music and more as an auditory assault, with percussion mimicking accelerating heartbeats and industrial noise suggesting the grinding inevitability of the train itself. Silence is deployed strategically, often preceding moments of extreme violence, so that the subsequent impact feels more shocking. The audio team ensures that every punch, every blade strike, and every bone fracture registers with sickening clarity, refusing to let the audience maintain comfortable distance from the carnage unfolding on screen. Tanya Maniktala appears as Talika Singh, the emotional anchor whose presence haunts the film long after her character's brutal death. Though her screen time is limited to roughly the first third of the runtime, Maniktala establishes Talika as a fully realized person rather than merely a plot device to motivate the hero's vengeance. Her quiet strength in confronting her domineering father, her conflicted feelings about abandoning family duty for love, and her final moments of terror and defiance all contribute to making her death genuinely devastating rather than narratively convenient. The image of her handprint in blood on the train window glass, followed by Fani's blade, has been cited by multiple critics as one of the most haunting visual compositions in recent Indian cinema. Abhishek Chauhan portrays Varesh, Amrit's fellow commando and best friend, whose presence provides both tactical support and emotional grounding throughout the escalating crisis. Varesh functions as the audience's surrogate in many ways, reacting to the mounting horror with the appropriate terror and disbelief, while Amrit increasingly detaches from normal human responses. The friendship between these two soldiers, established through brief but effective scenes of camaraderie before the hijacking begins, makes Varesh's eventual death at Fani's hands register as another devastating blow that pushes Amrit past any remaining threshold of restraint or self-preservation. Ashish Vidyarthi brings decades of experience to the role of Benny, the gang patriarch waiting at the station who boards the train to find his criminal enterprise in ruins and his family members dead. Unlike his psychotic son Fani, Benny represents the older generation of dacoits who understood robbery as a transaction rather than an opportunity for sadistic pleasure. His growing horror at the escalating violence, his desperate attempts to negotiate an exit strategy, and his ultimate inability to control the monster he has created all add layers of tragic complexity to what could have been a straightforward villain role. Vidyarthi's weathered face communicates volumes about the weariness of a man who has lived too long in a world of violence. The cinematography by Rafi Mahmood transforms the train's cramped interiors into an expressionist nightmare through strategic use of practical lighting, including the sickly fluorescent glow of sleeper compartment bulbs that cast harsh shadows and render flesh tones in unflattering pallor. Emergency lighting bathes later sequences in hellish red, while the darkness rushing past windows creates a constant reminder that there is nowhere to escape, no exterior world to provide rescue or refuge. Mahmood's camera remains intimate and claustrophobic throughout, rarely pulling back for establishing shots once the violence begins, keeping audiences trapped alongside the characters in the narrow corridors and cramped compartments. The editing by Shivkumar V. Panikkar maintains breathtaking momentum throughout the 105-minute runtime without sacrificing spatial coherence, a common failure in action cinema where rapid cutting often disguises inadequate choreography. Every blow registers clearly, every spatial relationship remains legible despite the chaos, and the geography of the train becomes increasingly familiar to viewers as Amrit moves methodically through each carriage on his mission of extermination. Panikkar's cutting rhythm accelerates during combat sequences to mirror adrenaline spikes, then slows deliberately during moments of aftermath, allowing the consequences of violence to land with full emotional weight. The film's class commentary operates as a persistent undercurrent beneath the surface-level action, transforming what could be simple good versus evil dynamics into something more politically charged. The bandits are not supernatural monsters, but desperate men from impoverished backgrounds who have turned to crime as economic necessity. Baldev Singh Thakur, Talika's wealthy father, is portrayed as arrogant and controlling, his immense fortune providing no protection against the violence that his class position has indirectly helped create. The train itself, traversing the landscape while carrying both the ultra-wealthy in first-class compartments and the predatory poor who prey upon them, becomes a microcosm of India's economic inequality. Fani's characterization as a bandit who explicitly rejects traditional codes of honor represents a generational critique within the criminal underworld itself. His father Benny understands that kidnapping a powerful businessman like Baldev Singh Thakur would bring catastrophic retaliation, that certain lines should not be crossed even in lawlessness. Fani dismisses such caution as weakness, his nihilism representing something more terrifying than calculated criminality. He kills not for profit, but for pleasure, not strategically but impulsively, and his inability to comprehend long-term consequences ultimately destroys not only himself, but his entire extended family aboard the train. The film's treatment of the police and security forces offers a bleak assessment of institutional protection. When a police squad finally boards the train in response to emergency calls, they are swiftly and brutally eliminated by Fani's remaining men, their training proving inadequate against the sheer viciousness of opponents who have abandoned all self-preservation instinct. This narrative choice strips away any hope of external rescue, reinforcing the isolation of the train and the absolute responsibility falling upon Amrit's shoulders. The state cannot save anyone here. Only individual capacity for violence matters. The visual design of Amrit's transformation deserves analysis as a conscious deconstruction of the action hero archetype. He begins the film clean-shaven and uniformed, the picture of military discipline. As the night progresses and the body count rises, his clothing becomes shredded, his face increasingly blood-smeared and unrecognizable, his movements shifting from trained precision to animalistic savagery. By the final confrontation, he has become visually indistinguishable from the bandits he hunts, bare-chested and wounded, and operating on pure instinct rather than any recognizable human motivation. The relationship between Talika's younger sister Ahayana and the unfolding horror provides an important perspective on collateral trauma. As the youngest member of the Singh family aboard the train, Ahayana witnesses events that will permanently scar her psyche, including the deaths of multiple family members and the transformation of a family friend into a killing machine. Her survival becomes one of the film's few moral victories, but the script refuses to pretend that survival equals happiness, acknowledging that she will carry these memories for the remainder of her life. The use of improvised weapons throughout the combat sequences speaks to the film's commitment to visceral realism over stylized fantasy. Amrit does not possess an unlimited arsenal or magical combat abilities. He grabs whatever is available in the environment and uses it until it breaks or is lost. Fire extinguishers become bludgeons, privacy chains become garrotes, shattered glass becomes cutting implements, and lighter fluid becomes an instrument of horrific execution. This improvisational quality makes each fight feel desperate and unplanned rather than choreographed, even though the actual choreography is meticulously designed. The film's sound mix creates a hierarchy of violence that communicates severity through volume and texture. Background punches and blunt impacts register at one level, while the sounds that accompany killing blows occupy an entirely different sonic register, forcing audiences to flinch at the precise moment of fatality. The audio design refuses to sanitize death, ensuring that the wet, percussive reality of blades entering bodies and bones, shattering under extreme force, remains viscerally present throughout the experience. The narrative choice to give significant screen time to the bandits' perspectives distinguishes this film from simpler revenge narratives where antagonists exist only to be killed. The dacoits mourn their dead, argue amongst themselves about strategy, express fear and desire to retreat, and display genuine affection for family members. When Amrit hangs 12 bandit corpses in a single carriage as psychological warfare, the grief and horror this provokes among the surviving gang members is given as much dramatic weight as Amrit's own suffering. This moral complexity prevents the audience from enjoying the violence as simple catharsis. The international festival circuit embraced the film with unusual enthusiasm for an Indian action production, beginning with its premiere at the Toronto International Film Festival, where it placed as first runner-up for the People's Choice Award in the Midnight Madness category. The Tribeca Film Festival screening in June 2024 generated additional momentum before the wide theatrical release. This festival pedigree signals the film's crossover potential and its recognition by global cinephile audiences as something beyond typical genre fare, a validation that the creative team's ambitions toward elevating action cinema have been acknowledged by discerning viewers. The announcement that Chad Stahelski, the director of the John Wick franchise, will produce an English-language remake represents a remarkable vote of confidence in the material's international potential. Stahelski's involvement suggests that the American adaptation will maintain the punishing physicality and emotional bleakness that distinguish the original, rather than softening the material for mainstream Western audiences. The premise of a confined space revenge thriller translates across cultural boundaries with minimal adaptation required, though the specific class dynamics and Indian social context will presumably require thoughtful reimagining for different cultural settings. The critical reception has been overwhelmingly positive, with an 89% certified fresh rating on Rotten Tomatoes reflecting broad consensus that the film represents a significant achievement in action cinema. This critical embrace is particularly noteworthy given the extreme violence that typically divides reviewers and limits mainstream appeal. The film's success in convincing critics to look past the bloodshed to appreciate the craft, performances, and thematic depth beneath demonstrates the sophistication of Bhatt's approach to material that could easily have been dismissed as exploitative. The box office performance, grossing approximately 47 crore rupees worldwide against a budget of approximately 40 crore, represents a modest commercial success rather than a blockbuster. However, these numbers do not fully capture the film's impact, which extends beyond immediate theatrical returns to include international distribution deals, streaming rights, and the valuable intellectual property demonstrated by the remake rights acquisition. For an R-rated action film with no major stars and extreme violence, achieving profitability while generating significant critical acclaim and industry attention constitutes a meaningful success. The film's positioning within the broader context of Indian cinema's international crossover moment places it alongside productions like RRR, Pathan, and Jawan that have expanded global audiences for Indian action filmmaking. However, this film distinguishes itself through its unrelenting darkness and refusal to provide the musical numbers, comic relief, or triumphant endings that characterize even the most violent mainstream Indian productions. It represents a different path for Indian cinema's global ambitions, one aligned more closely with Korean extreme cinema than with the spectacle-driven model of recent crossover hits. The train setting functions as both literal location and metaphorical construct, its forward momentum mirroring the narrative's relentless progression toward annihilation. Trains in cinema have long represented the impossibility of escape from destiny, from Hitchcock's Strangers on a Train to Bong Joon-ho's Snowpiercer. The Rajdhani Express hurtling through the Indian night becomes a sealed universe where normal rules have been suspended, where the outside world might as well not exist, and where every mile of track brings characters closer to confrontations that cannot be avoided or postponed. The physical toll on Lakshya during production reportedly included multiple injuries, genuine exhaustion captured on camera, and the kind of method-adjacent suffering that produces authentic performances at considerable personal cost. The actor's willingness to push his body to its limits for his debut film role demonstrates commitment that audiences recognize as genuine, contributing to the sense that they are witnessing something real rather than merely performed. This physical authenticity has become increasingly rare in an era of digital effects and stunt doubles, making the film's dedication to practical action all the more valuable. The moral universe of the film refuses easy categorization, presenting a world where everyone is capable of monstrous acts given sufficient provocation. Amrit's transformation from protector to predator is presented not as heroic, but as tragic, a loss of self that costs him everything even as it allows him to achieve his bloody objectives. The final shot of the film, with Amrit sitting alone on a station bench hallucinating Talika's presence beside him, suggests that victory and annihilation have become indistinguishable, that the man who disembarks from the train is not the same person who boarded it, and that some journeys change travelers so fundamentally that return becomes impossible. The supporting cast of bandits, populated by character actors bringing individual personalities to what could have been interchangeable thugs, creates a sense of specific human lives being extinguished rather than anonymous enemies being defeated. Each bandit death carries weight because the audience has seen these men express fear, argue with leadership, mourn fallen comrades, and demonstrate the full range of human emotion despite their criminal actions. This approach makes the violence feel tragic rather than triumphant, complicating the audience's relationship with the protagonist's mission. The film's treatment of romantic love deserves analysis as both motivating force and cruel illusion. Amrit's love for Talika drives every decision he makes, from boarding the train to pursuing vengeance, yet that love ultimately saves no one and produces nothing but corpses. The film suggests that love in a world of violence becomes not salvation but additional vulnerability, another pressure point that can be exploited, another source of pain when inevitably destroyed. The hallucination of Talika at the film's conclusion reads not as comfort, but as haunting, a ghost created by the very love that was supposed to give life meaning. The Zippo lighter that becomes Amrit's signature improvised weapon carries symbolic weight throughout the later sequences, its flame representing both the passion that drove him to pursue Talika and the destructive fire that consumes everything he touches. The act of dousing Benny's head with lighter fluid and igniting it represents the complete abandonment of military discipline in favor of personal cruelty, a death so horrific that it forces even the sadistic Fani to confront what his actions have unleashed. Fire becomes the film's ultimate symbol of transformation, reducing everything it touches to ash. The editing pattern during the climactic confrontation between Amrit and Fani deserves specific attention for how it extends the sequence beyond expected duration, forcing audiences to sit with the brutality rather than experiencing it as quick catharsis. Blow after blow lands, both men reduced to bloody exhaustion, neither capable of the clean kill that would end the suffering. The extended nature of this final fight transforms it from action spectacle into something closer to endurance test, aligning viewer experience with character experience in a way that prioritizes realism over entertainment. The absence of traditional Bollywood elements, no musical numbers, no comic relief subplot, no romantic duets, represents a deliberate creative choice that signals the film's genre ambitions. By stripping away the elements that typically define Indian commercial cinema, Bhatt creates space for the kind of relentless tension that musical interludes or comedy beats would dissipate. This discipline and tone maintenance throughout the runtime demonstrates confidence that the core premise and execution are strong enough to sustain audience engagement without the conventional pleasures of Indian popular cinema. The color grading shifts perceptibly as the film progresses, moving from the naturalistic warmth of early scenes through increasingly desaturated and contrast-heavy imagery as violence escalates. By the final act, the palette has been reduced to near monochrome punctuated only by the red of blood, creating a visual environment that matches the moral simplification of Amrit's worldview. Everything has been reduced to targets and obstacles, survival and destruction, with no room for the complexity and color of normal human existence. The geography of the train is established through careful visual exposition in early scenes, ensuring that when violence erupts, audiences understand the spatial relationships between characters and the tactical possibilities and limitations of each carriage type. First-class compartments offer different combat environments than economy sleeper cars. The dining car presents distinct challenges from the luggage areas, and the narrow connecting passages between cars become lethal choke points where numbers count for less than positioning. This spatial literacy allows the action sequences to unfold with complexity without losing audience comprehension. The film's relationship to the action cinema tradition of the vulnerable hero connects it to films like Die Hard, while pushing the concept further into genuine physical degradation. John McClane finished his adventure battered and limping. Amrit finishes his barely able to sit upright, bleeding from multiple wounds, possibly dying, already hallucinating. The commitment to showing the real consequences of accumulated trauma. The way multiple injuries compound into systemic failure rather than being shaken off between scenes, grounds the fantastical body count in something approaching physiological reality. The decision to kill Varesh, Amrit's best friend and only remaining ally, represents a narrative choice that eliminates the last vestige of hope from the proceedings. With Talika dead and Varesh murdered, Amrit has nothing left to protect and no one left to save, transforming his mission from rescue to pure extermination. This structural move clarifies the film's thesis: that revenge is not about achieving positive outcomes, but about maximizing harm to those who have caused harm, a fundamentally destructive impulse that consumes the avenger as thoroughly as the targets. The international casting of the action choreographer and the influence of Korean extreme cinema on the film's visual language represent a globalization of Indian action aesthetics. Oh Se-young brings techniques developed in the Korean film industry's renowned action tradition, adapting them to the specific physical and cultural context of an Indian train journey. This cross-pollination produces something that feels neither derivative nor traditionally Indian, instead occupying a hybrid space that points toward possible futures for action cinema that transcend national boundaries. The thematic resonance of the train as a symbol of modernization and economic disparity deserves extended consideration. The Rajdhani Express, one of India's premier rail services, connects major cities and serves passengers across the economic spectrum, making it a perfect setting for a story about class collision. The bandits board not a random train, but one specifically carrying wealthy passengers. They're targeting a form of economic redistribution through violence that the film presents without endorsing, acknowledging the desperation that drives such acts while condemning the brutality they unleash. The religious and philosophical dimensions of the film, while not foreground, provide subtle context for its exploration of violence and morality. The concepts of karma, dharma, and the cycle of violence that consumes all participants resonate with Hindu philosophical traditions without being explicitly invoked. Amrit's journey can be read as a perversion of the warrior's dharma, duty transformed into obsession, righteous action curdling into murderous excess. The absence of divine intervention or cosmic justice reinforces the film's bleak worldview, where humans are solely responsible for the hells they create. The marketing campaign faced the challenge of positioning an ultra-violent film within a market where extreme gore typically limits commercial prospects, requiring careful calibration of promotional materials to attract action enthusiasts without alienating mainstream audiences. The strategy of emphasizing the film's festival credentials and critical acclaim alongside its visceral thrills successfully positioned it as prestige genre cinema rather than exploitation, a framing that the film's actual quality fully justifies. The legacy of the film within Indian cinema history will likely center on its demonstration that uncompromising genre filmmaking can achieve both critical respect and commercial viability without diluting its essential character. By refusing to soften its edges for broader appeal, the film has carved out a distinct identity that will influence subsequent Indian action productions. Future filmmakers seeking to push boundaries of violence and moral complexity will point to this production as proof that such ambitions can be realized within the Indian industry framework. The ending's ambiguity regarding Amrit's survival serves multiple narrative purposes, denying audiences the comfort of knowing whether the protagonist lives or dies after the credits roll. This refusal to provide closure respects the thematic seriousness of everything that has preceded it, acknowledging that some experiences are so shattering that questions of survival become almost irrelevant. Whether Amrit physically lives or dies, the person he was before boarding the train has been irrevocably killed, making the film's title applicable to its hero as much as its villains. The use of darkness and limited visibility in later sequences creates an almost horror film atmosphere, with attackers emerging from shadows and the confined spaces of train compartments becoming chambers of unpredictable terror. This visual approach acknowledges that the bandits know their environment better than the passengers, that darkness favors ambush predators over defenders, and that the civilized comfort of electric lighting is a fragile protection easily extinguished. The encroaching darkness parallels Amrit's psychological descent, external environment matching internal state. The film ultimately succeeds as both visceral entertainment and serious artistic statement by committing completely to its vision without hedging or compromise. Every creative choice, from the casting of a dancer as the primary villain to the Korean choreographer's bone-snapping realism to the delayed title card structural gambit, serves the unified purpose of creating an experience that audiences will feel physically as well as emotionally. This total commitment to effect over comfort, to impact over palatability, distinguishes the production from the countless action films that promise intensity, but deliver only the appearance of danger without its genuine sting. The geopolitical implications of setting such unrelenting carnage aboard the Rajdhani Express cannot be overstated, as this train service represents one of India's premier rail connections, linking the eastern city of Ranchi to the national capital of New Delhi, symbolically traversing the heartland of the world's largest democracy, while carrying passengers from every stratum of the socioeconomic hierarchy within its vibrating steel carriages. Director Nikhil Nagesh Bhatt selected this specific route not merely for logistical convenience, but for its profound resonance as a microcosm of contemporary Indian society, where billionaires and beggars, industrialists and laborers, the protected and the predatory all share the same confined space, hurtling through the darkness at high velocity with no option for exit until the scheduled stops arrive. The train becomes a nation in miniature, its carriages representing segregated economic realities that the violence forcibly integrates, forcing first-class passengers protected by locked compartment doors to confront the brutal consequences of the inequality their comfort depends upon maintaining at a safe distance. The performance of Raghav Juyal as Fani deserves extended examination for how the actor weaponizes his background in dance and physical performance to create a villain whose body language communicates menace even in stillness, his limbs perpetually coiled with potential energy that might explode into violence or mockery without warning. Juyal reportedly studied footage of predatory animals before filming, incorporating the patient stillness of a leopard before the pounce into Fani's distinctive physical vocabulary, creating a character who seems to occupy a different evolutionary category than his victims. His line deliveries arrive with the casual cruelty of someone who has never been held accountable for anything in his life, each threat delivered with a smile that suggests genuine amusement at the suffering he causes, transforming murder into a form of entertainment for his own private amusement. The sound design team faced the extraordinary challenge of creating an auditory environment that would sustain tension across an entire feature-length runtime without exhausting audiences or numbing them to the violence through overexposure, requiring a sophisticated approach to dynamic range that alternates between punishing cacophony and almost unbearable silence. Every surface aboard the train produces distinct acoustic signatures when struck, cut, or broken, and the sound team mapped these meticulously to ensure that audiences could track the spatial progression of violence through audio cues alone during moments when the visuals become too chaotic to parse instantly. The train itself functions as an additional instrument in the sonic landscape, its rhythmic clatter providing an underlying percussion that accelerates and decelerates with the narrative tension, sometimes drowning under screams and sometimes emerging as the only sound during moments of exhausted aftermath. The thematic exploration of toxic masculinity operates on multiple levels throughout the narrative, examining how patriarchal systems damage not only women, but the men trapped within their expectations of dominance, violence, and emotional repression. Amrit's inability to express his grief through any mechanism except escalating violence represents a specifically masculine tragedy. A man so conditioned to solve problems through physical force that he has lost access to any other mode of responding to loss. Fani's sadism equally represents a perversion of masculine performance, cruelty adopted as identity because his culture has taught him that dominance through fear constitutes the highest expression of manhood. A lesson he has internalized so completely that he cannot conceive of alternative ways to exist in the world. Baldev Singh Thakur, though a secondary character in terms of screen time, embodies the patriarchal authority that sets the entire tragedy in motion through his refusal to allow his daughter autonomy over her own life and romantic choices. His wealth and social position have accustomed him to absolute obedience from family members, and his determination to marry Talika to a man of his choosing rather than the soldier she loves represents the casual cruelty of patriarchal privilege that considers daughters as property to be transferred between male custodians. The irony that his attempt to control his daughter's future places her directly in the path of death aboard the train he selected for their travel speaks to the film's broader critique of how patriarchal systems ultimately destroy what they claim to protect. The film's relationship with its audience involves a deliberate strategy of escalating commitment, beginning with broadly accessible romantic and familial drama before gradually introducing elements that test viewer tolerance for violence in calibrated increments. This structural approach prevents the kind of immediate alienation that might occur if the extreme content appeared without emotional context, instead binding audiences to characters through empathy before subjecting those characters to increasingly unbearable suffering. By the time the violence reaches its most extreme expressions in the final act, viewers have become complicit through their continued engagement, unable to look away because they have invested too much emotional capital in seeing the journey through to its conclusion. The color theory employed by cinematographer Rafi Mahmoud follows a rigorous progression that externalizes the internal deterioration of the protagonist through environmental transformation, beginning with the warm amber tones of station platforms and early compartment scenes before shifting into the sickly fluorescent greens of institutional lighting as normalcy fractures. Blood appears increasingly vivid against these progressively desaturated backgrounds, its redness becoming the dominant chromatic element as the film advances, until the final sequences exist in a near-monochromatic world punctuated exclusively by crimson. This visual strategy ensures that violence feels increasingly transgressive as the film progresses, the contrast between blood and environment growing more pronounced rather than less, preventing the desensitization that repeated exposure might otherwise produce. The decision to cast Lakshya, a complete unknown to film audiences, as the lead represents a calculated risk that pays dividends in audience identification, as viewers bring no preconceptions from previous roles to their experience of Amrit's transformation. An established star would carry the baggage of their filmography into every scene, their previous heroic roles creating expectations of triumph that would undermine the film's commitment to deconstructing heroism itself. Lakshya's anonymity allows the character to exist purely within the boundaries of this single narrative, his face a blank slate upon which the film writes its tragedy without interference from external associations or audience expectations shaped by previous performances. The editing rhythm establishes a distinctive pattern of escalation and momentary decompression that mirrors the physiological experience of extreme stress, with combat sequences extending beyond comfortable duration until audiences begin to feel the same exhaustion that characters display on screen. These extended action passages are punctuated by brief moments of relative stillness that provide no genuine relief, but instead function as opportunities for the full emotional weight of preceding violence to register, characters and audience alike processing what has just occurred while dreading what inevitably approaches. This pattern prevents the film from becoming monotonous despite its relentless intensity, the brief respites serving to resensitize viewers for the next assault. The presence of Oh Se-young as action choreographer connects the production to the distinguished tradition of Korean extreme cinema, a national film culture that has consistently pushed boundaries of on-screen violence while maintaining artistic credibility and festival recognition. His previous work on films like Snowpiercer and The Villainous established his capacity for designing combat that serves narrative and character development rather than functioning as isolated spectacle, and his contribution here elevates the material beyond what Indian action choreography traditions might have achieved independently. The cross-pollination between Korean technical expertise and Indian storytelling traditions creates a hybrid aesthetic that feels genuinely novel rather than derivative of either source culture. The film's treatment of Talika's death, as both narrative necessity and ethical problem, deserves analysis, as the moment that most divides audiences in their assessment of the film's artistic merit versus its potential exploitation of female suffering. Critics who defend the choice emphasize that her death is not sexualized or lingered upon voyeuristically, that it serves a clear narrative purpose beyond shock value, and that the film never suggests her murder was justified or that Amrit's subsequent rampage represents an adequate response to loss. Detractors argue that the pattern of using women's deaths to motivate male character development remains problematic regardless of execution, that Talika exists primarily to die so Amrit can transform, and that alternative narrative structures could achieve similar effects without this particular gendered sacrifice. The production design team faced the specific challenge of creating multiple identical train carriages that would progressively deteriorate as the narrative advanced, each space needing to register the accumulated damage of previous violence while remaining functional as a combat arena for subsequent sequences. Blood spatter patterns, broken fixtures, shattered glass, and displaced luggage all had to be maintained in continuity across shooting days that occurred out of narrative sequence, requiring meticulous documentation and the creation of multiple versions of each carriage at different stages of destruction. This logistical complexity is invisible to audiences when executed successfully, but would have been immediately apparent and fatally distracting had any inconsistencies emerged in the finished film. The moral complexity of the film's final act refuses the cathartic satisfaction that the revenge genre traditionally promises, presenting Amrit's victory not as triumphant, but as a form of self-annihilation that leaves him physically shattered and psychologically broken on a station bench surrounded by security personnel who cannot comprehend what has transpired aboard the train. The hallucination of Talika sitting beside him in the final shot reads not as comfort or supernatural reunion, but as symptom of irreversible psychological damage, a mind that has experienced too much trauma to continue distinguishing between reality and wishful projection. This refusal of conventional resolution honors the film's commitment to showing violence as genuinely destructive rather than redemptive, a position that distinguishes it from virtually all mainstream action cinema. The international distribution strategy positioned the film as a prestige genre offering rather than a commercial action product, with festival premieres at Toronto and Tribeca establishing critical credibility before the wide theatrical release that targeted audiences beyond the typical Indian diaspora market. This approach reflects the evolving understanding that global audiences increasingly seek out international action cinema that offers perspectives and aesthetics unavailable in Hollywood productions, creating space for films from various national traditions to find dedicated viewership without compromising their cultural specificity. The involvement of Lionsgate in North American distribution further signaled the film's crossover ambitions and the industry's recognition of its potential beyond niche markets. The psychological realism of the bandits' behavior under pressure distinguishes them from the interchangeable antagonists of lesser action films, as they display the full range of human responses to extreme circumstances including cowardice, grief, rage, tactical calculation, and desperate self-preservation. When some bandits attempt to flee the train after witnessing Amrit's capabilities, they do so with the genuine terror of men who signed up for robbery and found themselves in a slaughterhouse, their professionalism dissolving the moment the situation exceeds their training and expectations. This attention to psychological authenticity extends even to the antagonists, ensuring that the film's world feels populated by recognizable humans rather than narrative functions in human shape. The philosophical questions raised by the film regarding the moral distinction between state-sanctioned violence and criminal violence become increasingly urgent as Amrit's body count rises and his methods become indistinguishable from those he pursues. As an NSG commando, Amrit has been trained to kill in service of national security objectives, his violence legitimized by the uniform he wears and the authorization he carries. Yet aboard the train, operating without orders or oversight, pursuing personal vengeance rather than national security, the line between soldier and murderer becomes impossible to locate with any precision, an ambiguity the film refuses to resolve in either direction. The influence of video game aesthetics on the film's structure emerges in its progression through increasingly difficult combat encounters, each carriage functioning as a new level with distinct environmental challenges and enemy configurations that Amrit must overcome through a combination of tactical adaptation and accumulated damage. This structural similarity to gaming narratives is not coincidental, but reflects the media consumption patterns of contemporary audiences who process action sequences through frameworks developed by interactive entertainment, a literacy that filmmakers can leverage to achieve spatial and narrative complexity without extensive exposition. The film essentially functions as a single-player action game rendered in cinematic language, complete with boss encounters and escalating difficulty curves. The decision to withhold the title card until the moment of Talika's murder represents not merely a structural gimmick, but a philosophical statement about the nature of the film audiences have been watching, retroactively recontextualizing everything that preceded it as prologue rather than substance. This technique borrows from literary traditions where a novel's true subject becomes apparent only after extended introduction. But applied to cinema, it creates a uniquely jarring effect that forces audiences to recalibrate their understanding of the narrative contract they have entered. The title functions as a warning and a promise, announcing that the film is now becoming what it was always intended to be, and that audiences unprepared for this transformation should look away. The economic subtext of the bandits' motivation deserves examination beyond simple criminality, as their targeting of the Rajani Express specifically reflects an understanding of which routes carry passengers worth robbing and which security gaps can be exploited with acceptable risk. These are not random criminals, but calculating entrepreneurs of violence who have assessed market conditions and identified profitable opportunities. They're a legal enterprise functioning according to the same capitalist logic that governs legitimate business. Fani's deviation from this rational criminality into personal vendetta represents not merely moral failure, but business failure, emotional indulgence destroying what should have been a straightforward transaction. The film's representation of the NSG, India's elite counterterrorism force colloquially known as the Black Cats, carries political implications regarding the depiction of Special Forces personnel operating outside their sanctioned mandate and chain of command. Amrit's decision to pursue personal objectives rather than report the situation through proper channels represents a fundamental breach of military discipline, yet the film presents this choice as humanly understandable if professionally indefensible. The tension between institutional loyalty and personal moral obligation creates a secondary conflict that complicates audience sympathy for the protagonist even as his immediate tactical decisions seem justified by circumstances. The relationship between Amrit and his deceased mother, mentioned briefly but never elaborated, suggests psychological depths that the film deliberately declines to explore through flashback or exposition, trusting audiences to infer the formative experiences that shaped a man capable of such controlled violence. This restraint in characterization represents a sophisticated understanding that mystery can be more compelling than explanation, that leaving certain aspects of the protagonist's psychology unexplored creates space for audience projection and interpretation that detailed backstory would foreclose. Amrit's mother exists as an absence that shapes his capacity for attachment and loss without the film needing to articulate exactly how. The linguistic diversity aboard the train reflects authentic Indian social reality, with characters code-switching between Hindi, English, and regional languages depending on context, relationship, and emotional state. This multilingual texture would be largely invisible to international audiences reading subtitles, but adds significant verisimilitude for domestic viewers who recognize the class and regional markers embedded in language choice. The bandits' dialect specifically locates them geographically and economically, their speech patterns as informative about their origins as their clothing or weaponry, creating a rich audiovisual tapestry that operates on multiple levels of cultural signification. The choreographic distinction between Amrit's military combat training and the bandits' street-fighting brutality provides visual interest throughout the action sequences, while also communicating character through movement style. Amrit's initial engagements display the economy and efficiency of professional military training, each movement purposeful and minimal, while the bandits swing wildly with undisciplined aggression that is simultaneously more chaotic and less effective. As the film progresses and Amrit descends into personal vengeance, his fighting style degrades from military precision into something more primal, the distinction between trained soldier and desperate killer gradually disappearing from his physical vocabulary. The cameo appearances by veteran character actors in minor roles aboard the train create a sense of populated reality that extends beyond the principal characters, suggesting that every passenger compartment contains complete human stories. Interrupted by catastrophe. These brief performances, some lasting only seconds before death arrives, contribute to the film's emotional texture by reminding audiences that the violence affects not only named characters, but an entire community of travelers whose journeys have been permanently diverted into nightmare. The egalitarianism of this violence, striking random passengers and principal characters alike, reinforces the film's thesis that catastrophe makes no distinctions between important and unimportant lives. The film's title, in its brutal simplicity, functions as both description and imperative, a word that operates simultaneously as noun and verb, naming both the act and its consequence. This linguistic efficiency mirrors the film's broader aesthetic commitment to stripping away excess until only essential elements remain, a philosophy applied equally to dialogue, characterization, and visual composition. The title promises exactly what the film delivers, making no attempt to disguise its intentions behind euphemism or metaphor, establishing an honest contract with audiences that the subsequent experience fulfills without deviation or apology. The closing moments aboard the train, before the epilogue at the station, achieve a quality of exhausted stillness that feels genuinely earned after the relentless movement that preceded it, the sudden absence of violence creating a vacuum that characters and audience alike must navigate without guidance. Bodies remain where they fell, blood continues its slow spread across flooring and upholstery, and the survivors move through the aftermath with the dazed incomprehension of those who have witnessed too much to process immediately. This refusal to provide a clean conclusion, to restore order and meaning, represents the film's final and most significant departure from genre convention, leaving audiences with questions rather than answers about what they have witnessed and what it signifies. The film's engagement with the philosophy of nonviolence, deeply embedded in Indian cultural and political history through figures like Gandhi, operates as a haunting absence rather than an explicit argument, the complete rejection of ahimsa by every character creating a negative space where pacifist principles might have existed, but have been systematically eliminated by circumstance and human failure. Amrit's profession as a soldier already positions him outside the strictest interpretations of nonviolence. Yet his initial reluctance to kill represents a residual moral framework that the train's enclosed brutality progressively strips away until nothing remains but the pure calculus of survival through extermination. The film does not argue against nonviolence so much as demonstrate its impossibility under certain conditions, a Hobbesian vision of human nature emerging when the thin protections of civilization are removed and individuals are reduced to their capacity for destruction. The marketing materials deliberately evoked comparisons to The Raid and John Wick, while the actual film experience proves considerably more emotionally devastating than either franchise, which despite their extreme violence maintain a certain comic book distance from the suffering they depict. John Wick's body count exists in a stylized underworld with its own rules and aesthetics, while The Raid's martial arts choreography carries the exhilaration of athletic performance even at its most brutal. This film strips away these protective layers, refusing to make violence fun or beautiful, insisting instead on its ugliness and its cost, a distinction that becomes apparent only in the watching rather than the describing. Audiences expecting the cathartic thrill of those earlier films find instead something closer to endurance test, the entertainment value replaced by something more challenging and less comfortable. The hierarchical structure within the bandit gang, with Benny as patriarch and Fani as heir apparent, mirrors the legitimate family business structures that dominate Indian economic life, suggesting that criminal enterprise and legitimate commerce differ primarily in their relationship to state authorization rather than their fundamental organizational principles. The tensions between generations that characterize family businesses everywhere play out in lethal terms aboard the train, with Benny's pragmatic risk calculation colliding against Fani's impulsive cruelty, experience arguing with youth's sense of invulnerability. This generational conflict within criminality parallels the conflict between Baldev and Talika in the legitimate world, parents attempting to control children who have developed their own values and priorities that the older generation cannot comprehend. The train's constant forward motion creates a temporal pressure that distinguishes this narrative from siege films set in static locations, as every mile of track brings the journey closer to its scheduled conclusion at a station where authorities will be waiting and the contained chaos must confront external reality. Characters make decisions with the awareness that time is literally running out, that the window for action closes with each passing minute, creating dramatic urgency that a static setting could not generate. The train schedule becomes an additional antagonist, its predetermined stops and expected arrivals structuring the narrative around immutable deadlines that neither heroes nor villains can negotiate or postpone. The decision to show the bandits praying, mourning their dead according to their cultural traditions, and expressing genuine familial affection complicates audience response by humanizing individuals whom the genre typically reduces to target practice. When Amrit kills these men, he extinguishes not merely threats but believers, fathers, sons, and brothers, the full humanity of his victims insisted upon by a camera that lingers on their grief-stricken survivors with the same attention given to the protagonist's suffering. This even-handedness in depicting loss across moral lines prevents the comfortable self-righteousness that lesser revenge narratives cultivate, replacing it with the more difficult recognition that every corpse represents an irreplaceable human world extinguished. The color of blood itself becomes a subject of aesthetic consideration, its appearance shifting subtly as the film progresses from the bright arterial red of initial wounds to the darker, almost black congealing that marks older injuries and corpses. The makeup and effects teams clearly studied the visual progression of blood outside the body, how it changes as it dries, how it behaves on different surfaces, how its color shifts under varying light conditions, creating a forensic accuracy that contributes to the film's overall commitment to violence that feels documented rather than designed. This attention to hematological detail would escape conscious notice for most viewers while contributing subliminally to the sense of authenticity that distinguishes the production. The relationship between the film's extreme content and its festival reception reveals interesting tensions in how cultural institutions evaluate violent cinema, with the Toronto International Film Festival's Midnight Madness section providing a context where transgressive content is expected and celebrated, while the broader critical establishment must negotiate between acknowledging craft and condemning excess. The first runner-up placement for the People's Choice Award in that category suggests that festival audiences found something beyond exploitation in the experience, that the film's artistic ambitions registered even amid sequences designed to test the limits of viewer endurance. This festival validation has become increasingly important for extreme cinema, seeking to avoid the ghettoization that historically confined violent genre films to direct-to-video distribution. The film's release during the American Independence Day weekend of July 2024 positioned it against major Hollywood blockbusters, including Despicable Me 4 and the continued runs of Inside Out 2 and A Quiet Place. Day 1. A counter-programming strategy that offered adult audiences something radically different from the family-friendly fare and franchise extensions dominating multiplex screens. The critical scores that exceeded several of these Hollywood competitors generated media narratives about the film punching above its weight class, a David versus Goliath framing that benefited the marketing while accurately reflecting the qualitative distinctions that reviewers identified. This strategic positioning demonstrates the evolving sophistication of Indian cinema's international distribution, understanding that quality and distinctiveness can carve space even in the most competitive release windows. The film's relationship with the long tradition of dacoit narratives in Indian cinema, from Sholay to Bandit Queen to the more recent Sankirya, deserves recognition as both continuation and subversion of established tropes. The dacoit has functioned variously as villain, antihero, and tragic figure throughout Indian film history, representing both the failure of the state to provide for its citizens and the romantic appeal of those who operate outside law's constraints. Fani represents the dacoit stripped of all romanticism, the bandit reduced to pure predatory impulse without the honor codes or social banditry that earlier depictions emphasized, a figure whose charisma serves only to make his fundamental emptiness more apparent. The physical toll on the supporting cast and stunt performers, largely invisible to audiences but essential to the film's achievement, represents a labor practice that deserves acknowledgement within discussions of the film's violence. The Indian stunt industry has historically operated with fewer protections than its Hollywood counterparts, and the intensity of the action sequences documented on screen reflects real physical risk undertaken by performers whose names appear briefly in credits that most audiences have already stopped watching. The film's achievement rests substantially on their unheralded work, their willingness to endure impacts, falls, and the cumulative exhaustion of repeated takes of extreme physical action. A contribution that critical appreciation of action choreography should always contextualize. The film's relationship to the melodramatic traditions of Indian popular cinema functions as both inheritance and rejection, incorporating the emotional extremism that characterizes Bollywood storytelling while stripping away the musical numbers, comic subplots, and tonal variety that traditionally provide relief from intensity. This selective inheritance creates something that feels recognizably Indian in its emotional architecture while utterly foreign in its sustained darkness. A hybrid that satisfies neither audiences seeking traditional Bollywood pleasures, nor those looking for the ironic distance of postmodern action cinema. The film demands to be taken seriously on its own terms, refusing to provide the escape hatches that either set of generic expectations might offer. The decision to structure the bandit gang as an extended family operation rather than a professional criminal organization introduces dynamics of loyalty, obligation, and grief that would be absent from a group of mercenaries assembled purely for profit. When Fani makes decisions that prioritize personal vengeance over the gang's survival, he violates not merely tactical logic, but familial obligation, endangering relatives who trusted his leadership because of blood ties rather than professional assessment. This family structure makes the gang simultaneously more sympathetic and more terrifying, their violence motivated by recognizable human bonds, even as those bonds drive them toward self-destruction. The film's post-credits silence, breaking with the now-standard Marvel-influenced practice of appending additional scenes, represents a final aesthetic choice that respects the gravity of everything that has preceded it. There is nothing to tease, no franchise to build, no levity to restore, only the quiet aftermath of catastrophe that audiences must sit with as the lights come up and the real world reasserts its claim on their attention. This refusal to soften the exit honors the film's commitment to providing an experience rather than a product, trusting that audiences who have endured the journey do not require a spoonful of sugar to help the medicine go down. The film's engagement with the politics of the Indian railway system, a vast network that moves millions daily and has been the site of numerous terrorist attacks and criminal incidents throughout its history, grounds the fantastic violence in a reality that Indian audiences recognize from news reports and personal experience. Train journeys in India involve a temporary suspension of normal social boundaries, strangers sharing confined spaces for extended periods. The trust required for this proximity rendered terrifying when violated. The film exploits this specific cultural anxiety, the vulnerability of the sleeper compartment, the impossibility of escape from a moving train, the delayed response time of authorities at distant stations. The cinematographic decision to avoid the slow-motion hero shots that characterize much Indian action cinema represents another deliberate departure from generic expectation. With Amrit's most impressive physical feats captured at normal speed or even accelerated, denying audiences the opportunity to savor his prowess aesthetically. When violence occurs in real time, it is sudden, ugly, and over before it can be processed, the opposite of the balletic slow motion that makes killing beautiful in lesser action films. This temporal honesty extends the film's broader commitment to presenting violence as it might actually feel rather than as it has been conventionally aestheticized. The psychological condition of hypervigilance, familiar to combat veterans and trauma survivors, finds cinematic expression in the later sequences as Amrit's perception has been permanently altered by sustained exposure to lethal threat. His reactions become preconscious, his body responding to stimuli before his mind can process them. The training that once required conscious application, now operating below the threshold of awareness. This representation of traumatized perception, while dramatized for cinematic effect, acknowledges the neurological reality that extreme stress fundamentally changes how the brain processes sensory information. A truth that action cinema typically ignores in favor of heroes who remain psychologically intact regardless of what they experience. The wardrobe choices for Talika, particularly the bridal attire she wears during the journey, carry symbolic weight that transforms as the narrative progresses from celebration to tragedy. What begins as the costume of impending marriage becomes progressively disheveled through the chaos, her bridal finery increasingly incongruous against the blood and destruction surrounding her, until it becomes the garment in which she dies. The white or red of bridal attire, depending on regional tradition, carries specific cultural resonances around purity, transition, and sacrifice that her death activates in ways that would resonate differently for Indian and international audiences, but function powerfully in both contexts. The film's relationship to the action-horror hybrid genre that has produced films like Train to Busan and The Night Comes for Us positions it within a growing international movement toward action cinema that incorporates horror's commitment to genuine dread rather than the excitement that action typically cultivates. The difference between thrill and horror lies substantially in the audience's relationship to the violence depicted, whether it generates exhilaration or distress, and the film consistently pushes toward the latter pole despite operating within action's structural framework. This tonal border-crossing accounts for the polarized responses the film generates, with some viewers experiencing generic betrayal when the expected catharsis fails to arrive. The architecture of the Rajani Express, with its narrow corridors, privacy curtains, fold-down bunks, and connecting doors, creates a combat environment fundamentally different from the open spaces where most action cinema unfolds, requiring choreography that works in vertical as well as horizontal dimensions. Fighters must contend with overhead luggage racks, the limited headroom of upper bunks, the obstruction of privacy curtains that simultaneously conceal and entangle, and the constant instability of a moving platform that makes footing uncertain. This environmental specificity ensures that the action feels genuinely responsive to location rather than generic combat that could occur anywhere, grounding even the most extreme violence in the particular physical reality of the train. The film's refusal to provide moral commentary through authorial voice, allowing events to unfold without explicit judgment from the filmmaker, places interpretive responsibility entirely on the audience in a manner that respects viewer intelligence while risking moral confusion. But does not tell us what to think about Amrit's transformation, does not editorialize about the justice or injustice of particular killings, does not provide a character who functions as moral compass articulating the film's ethical position. This narrative silence forces audiences to engage actively with the moral questions the film raises, rather than passively receiving predetermined conclusions, an approach that distinguishes serious cinema from propaganda regardless of the spectacular violence surrounding it. The international remake rights acquisition by Chad Stahelski's production company raises complex questions about cultural translation, as the specific Indian contexts that give the film its texture and meaning will inevitably transform when relocated to different national and cultural settings. What aspects of the original are essential, and what can change while preserving the core experience become practical questions for adaptation rather than theoretical exercises, testing whether the film's power derives from its universal elements of confined space survival or its specific engagement with Indian social reality. The remake will serve as an unintended experiment in identifying what exactly makes the original work, as successful adaptation clarifies what was essential all along. The film's emotional logic operates according to a calculus of loss that transforms grief into fuel for violence, suggesting that the deepest human attachments become the most powerful motivations for inhuman behavior. Amrit's love for Talika, the most beautiful aspect of his character, becomes the engine of his most terrible actions, the positive emotion curdling into its opposite through the alchemy of trauma. This transformation suggests something uncomfortable about the proximity of love and violence, how the same intensity of feeling that creates the most profound human connections can, when those connections are severed, generate destruction beyond rational calculation or moral constraint. The sound of the train itself, its rhythmic passage over rail joints creating a percussive pulse that underlies every scene, functions as an auditory reminder of inescapable forward motion, the impossibility of stopping, the continuous approach of whatever destination awaits. This mechanical heartbeat accelerates during action sequences through editorial emphasis, then recedes during aftermath moments without ever completely disappearing. The train's constant presence as fundamental to the film's sonic identity as breathing is to human existence. Viewers who notice this constant are subtly reminded of their own entrapment, unable to leave the theater without the film's permission, carried forward by the inexorable progression of the runtime toward a conclusion they anticipate with dread. The deployment of silence as a weapon in the sound mix represents one of the film's most sophisticated technical achievements, with sudden absences of audio creating moments of almost unbearable tension that prepare audiences for the sonic violence that inevitably follows these brief voids. Editor Shivkumar V. Paniker and the sound team collaborated to identify precise moments where complete auditory withdrawal would maximize subsequent impact, timing these silences to coincide with character realizations or audience anticipations of impending violence. The effect mimics the psychological phenomenon of auditory exclusion reported by combat veterans, where the brain temporarily stops processing sound during moments of extreme threat, providing audiences with a neurological simulation of the protagonist's subjective experience rather than objective documentation of events. The representation of Baldev Singh Thakur's impotence despite his immense wealth and social power delivers a pointed critique of how economic privilege provides only the illusion of control while leaving its possessors fundamentally vulnerable to forces that recognize neither bank balances nor family names. His money cannot stop Fani's blade. His connections cannot summon help to a speeding train. His lifetime of commanding obedience through financial leverage proves utterly worthless in a context where only physical violence carries currency. The film systematically strips him of dignity, forcing this patriarch who has controlled his family through wealth and authority to witness his complete powerlessness as everything he has built collapses in an environment indifferent to his status. The choice to make Amrit an NSG commando rather than a civilian with extraordinary abilities grounds his combat competence in institutional training that audiences can accept without the suspension of disbelief required by action heroes who inexplicably possess elite fighting skills despite ordinary backgrounds. The Black Cats undergo some of the world's most rigorous counterterrorism training, including close-quarters battle, hostage rescue, and the psychological conditioning necessary to maintain operational effectiveness under extreme stress, all of which the film implicitly references through Amrit's tactical decisions and combat efficiency. This professional background transforms what might seem superhuman into merely exceptional, the difference between fantasy and the documented capabilities of real special forces operators. The film's engagement with the concept of honor among thieves receives a thorough deconstruction through Fani's character, who represents the generational abandonment of whatever ethical codes once governed criminal behavior within the dacoit tradition. His father Benny understands that kidnapping Baldev Singh Thakur would bring catastrophic retaliation, that certain boundaries exist even in lawlessness, that robbery operates most successfully when it remains transactional rather than personal. Fani's complete rejection of these pragmatic limits, his willingness to murder for pleasure and pursue vengeance at any cost, marks him as belonging to a new and more terrifying category of criminal for whom no code exists and no consequence matters. The visual motif of reflections in glass, introduced with the handprint of blood that Talika leaves on the train window as she dies, recurs throughout the film as characters encounter their own transformed images in mirrors, windows, and polished surfaces that force momentary self-confrontation. Amrit's progressive inability to recognize himself in these reflective surfaces tracks his psychological transformation, the face he sees becoming increasingly alien as the night advances and his actions carry him further from the person he believed himself to be. This visual strategy externalizes the internal fragmentation that violence produces, the self literally splitting into observer and observed as trauma disrupts the continuity of identity. The decision to kill Varesh rather than allowing him to survive as the loyal sidekick who typically endures to provide emotional support in the final reel demonstrates the film's commitment to narrative logic over audience comfort, as his death removes the last character whose survival might have provided Amrit with a reason to exercise restraint. Their friendship, established through brief but effective scenes of camaraderie, represents the final human connection in Amrit's life after Talika's murder, and its extinguishment completes the process of isolating the protagonist within a world where nothing remains worth protecting. Varesh dies not as a plot convenience, but as a logical consequence of the situation the film has constructed, his survival impossible given the tactical realities of the final confrontation. The international critical response to the film reveals interesting patterns in how different cultural contexts evaluate extreme cinematic violence. With Western critics generally more comfortable celebrating transgressive content as artistic expression, while some Indian critics expressed concern about the film's departure from the moral frameworks that traditionally govern depictions of violence in Indian popular cinema. This divergence reflects broader cultural differences in the social function assigned to cinematic violence, whether it is understood primarily as aesthetic expression or as potentially influential on social behavior. A debate that the film's international success has brought into sharper focus within Indian film criticism communities. The practical effects team deserves recognition for creating wounds, corpses, and blood effects that maintain verisimilitude across the extended running time without the digital enhancement that increasingly characterizes even R-rated action cinema. The decision to rely primarily on practical gore rather than computer-generated imagery reflects both budgetary constraints and artistic philosophy, as physical effects interact with lighting, actors, and camera movement in ways that digital effects cannot fully replicate. The tangibility of the carnage, the way blood pools and spreads according to actual physics rather than algorithmic simulation, contributes significantly to the film's unsettling power. The film's relationship to the tradition of siege narratives, from Assault on Precinct 13 to the more recent Green Room, positions it within a subgenre defined by the defense of confined spaces against numerically superior attackers, though the narrative inverts this structure by making the confined space a moving vehicle from which escape is impossible rather than a fortress to be defended. This inversion transforms the siege dynamic, as the defenders cannot fortify a position or establish a perimeter, instead forced into constant movement through enemy-controlled territory where every carriage represents a new battleground with unknown threats. The forward momentum of the train adds temporal pressure absent from static sieges, the journey's scheduled conclusion providing an external deadline that neither side can manipulate. The casting of Ashish Vidyarthi as Benny brings decades of experience playing authority figures and antagonists to a role that requires communicating volumes through minimal dialogue, his weathered face and commanding presence establishing the gang patriarch's authority before he speaks a single word. Vidyarthi's performance emphasizes Benny's exhaustion, the weariness of a man who has survived decades in a violent profession and recognizes that his son's recklessness threatens to destroy everything he has built. His death, burned alive by Amrit's lighter fluid, carries a tragic dimension absent from the more satisfying dispatching of Fani, as Benny represents a version of criminality that understood limits even if it did not respect laws. The film's treatment of collateral damage among innocent passengers functions as an implicit critique of action cinema's tendency to ignore civilian casualties, with every background death receiving acknowledgement through reaction shots, audio cues, or the visible impact on surviving characters. When bandits kill passengers in pursuit of Amrit, the film does not allow audiences to forget these deaths as acceptable losses in the hero's mission, instead insisting that every corpse represents a moral failure and a human tragedy. This attention to the cost of violence distinguishes the film from the body count cinema, where only named characters' deaths carry emotional weight. The philosophical tension between retributive and restorative justice provides an intellectual framework for understanding Amrit's transformation, as his initial commitment to protecting the innocent represents a restorative impulse that the situation's brutality progressively transforms into pure retribution without any restorative outcome. His killing spree achieves nothing beyond the satisfaction of vengeance, rescuing no one, preventing no future crimes, building no better world, merely adding corpses to corpses in an escalating exchange that benefits only death itself. The film's bleakness stems from this recognition that justice and revenge have become entirely unmoored from each other, that the former cannot be achieved through the mechanisms of the latter regardless of how satisfying those mechanisms might feel. The production's use of a real-moving train for many sequences, rather than relying entirely on stationary sets with simulated motion, creates a physical authenticity that actors cited as essential to their performances, the genuine instability and claustrophobia of a moving railway carriage impossible to fully replicate through special effects. When characters stumble or lose balance during combat, many of these moments reflect genuine physical response rather than choreographed simulation, the performers' bodies reacting to actual motion rather than pretending to react to imagined instability. This commitment to practical production conditions extends the film's broader philosophy of authenticity, rejecting the easier path of simulated environments in favor of genuine physical experience. The gang's internal dynamics reveal fascinating patterns of loyalty, resentment, and authority that transform them from homogeneous antagonists into a complex social organism with its own history and tensions. Some bandits clearly resent Fani's leadership and the danger his impulsiveness creates, their obedience maintained through fear rather than respect, while others share his appetite for cruelty and encourage his excesses. These internal divisions create moments of hesitation and conflict that Amrit exploits tactically, the gang's lack of unity providing opportunities that a more disciplined enemy would not offer. The film understands that organizations under stress reveal their true nature, and Fani's gang under pressure reveals itself as unstable and ultimately self-destructive. The visual contrast between the train's interior and the darkness rushing past its windows creates a recurring composition that emphasizes the isolation of the characters from the world they have left behind. Cities and villages passing unseen in the night, while extraordinary violence unfolds inches from their sleeping inhabitants. Occasional glimpses of station platforms, briefly illuminated as the train passes without stopping, remind audiences that civilization continues to exist, that normal life proceeds unaware of the nightmare traveling through its midst. These fleeting images of an unreachable outside world intensify the claustrophobia, the proximity of safety that remains perpetually out of reach as the train maintains its inexorable forward progress. The film's relationship to the action cinema trope of the one-man army requires examination, as Amrit's effectiveness against overwhelming numbers initially appears to participate in this convention before the accumulated damage he sustains progressively undermines the fantasy of the invulnerable hero. By the final confrontation, he can barely stand, his movements sluggish and painful, his victories achieved through desperate improvisation rather than superior capability. The film acknowledges that even the most skilled combatant cannot sustain indefinite violence without degradation, that the body has limits regardless of the will driving it, that eventually even the greatest warrior falls to accumulated attrition. The psychological profiling of Fani suggests a personality structure organized around the need for stimulation and control, his violence escalating when circumstances deny him either, his sadism functioning as both entertainment and self-regulation. His mockery of victims, his theatrical line deliveries, his apparent enjoyment of suffering all indicate someone for whom cruelty has become the primary source of positive effect. A personality so damaged that only others' pain can generate the emotional response that healthy individuals derive from connection and achievement. Juyal's performance captures this emptiness beneath the charisma, the void that violence temporarily fills but can never permanently satisfy. The narrative's refusal to provide a romantic subplot that might offer relief from tension represents a discipline that lesser films would lack. The temptation to introduce attraction between survivors that might blossom into hope firmly resisted throughout. The only romance is the one that ends with Talika's death, and nothing replaces it, the emotional landscape remaining as barren as the visual landscape becomes monochromatic. This commitment to emotional austerity respects the reality that extreme trauma does not create space for new attachments, that survival mode forecloses the vulnerability that romance requires, that some experiences leave no room for anything except endurance. The marketing campaign's emphasis on the film's violence, while accurate, paradoxically undersells the emotional sophistication that distinguishes it from exploitation cinema, as potential audiences primed for pure sensation may miss the moral complexity that elevates the experience. The difficulty of communicating tonal nuance in promotional materials means that many viewers arrive expecting something simpler and less demanding than what the film actually delivers, a mismatch that accounts for some of the polarized audience responses. The film exists in the gap between its marketable elements and its actual achievements, a problem familiar to challenging works in every medium that resist the simplification required for effective promotion. The film's engagement with the concept of dharma, the complex Hindu framework of duty, righteousness, and cosmic order, operates implicitly through Amrit's progressive abandonment of his soldier's dharma in favor of personal vengeance that serves no higher purpose. His initial actions align with his professional obligation to protect civilians, a clear articulation of dharma that provides moral clarity, but his subsequent killings serve only personal satisfaction disconnected from any framework of righteousness or duty. The film traces this descent from dharma to adharma without using the terminology, the concepts embedded in the narrative architecture rather than the dialogue, accessible to viewers familiar with the philosophical tradition while remaining legible to those encountering the story without this cultural context. The film ultimately functions as a meditation on the limits of human endurance, not merely physical but psychological and moral, asking how much violence a person can both inflict and sustain before the self that existed before the violence becomes irrecoverable. Amrit's final hallucination of Talika represents not comfort but symptom, evidence that his psyche has fractured under pressure that exceeds any human capacity to absorb without permanent damage. The film answers its implicit question by showing a man who has exceeded every limit, who has survived physically while losing everything that made survival meaningful, a walking corpse whose heart continues beating despite the death of everything that gave that heartbeat purpose or value. This is not triumph, but its opposite. Victory defined so narrowly that it becomes indistinguishable from defeat, a conclusion that honors the film's unflinching examination of what violence actually costs those who employ it. The smellscape of the train, while impossible to convey directly through audiovisual media, is implicitly constructed through visual and auditory cues that suggest the progressive olfactory transformation of the environment from the mundane sense of railway travel to the overwhelming stench of blood, sweat, fear, and death that would characterize such a space after hours of sustained violence. The visual evidence of spilled fluids, the reactions of characters entering compartments where corpses have lain, the sheen of perspiration on every surviving face all work to create a synesthetic impression that engages audience imagination in constructing the sensory reality beyond what the screen can directly provide. This indirect olfactory world-building represents sophisticated cinematic technique, trusting viewers to complete the sensory picture through implication rather than explicit representation. The decision to limit the film's running time to a disciplined 105 minutes demonstrates editorial restraint that serves the material's intensity, as a longer cut would risk exhausting audiences beyond the point of productive engagement with the film's themes. Editor Shivkumar V. Panikkar clearly made difficult decisions about what to excise, prioritizing the maintenance of tension over the inclusion of every well-acted moment or impressive stunt, understanding that the film's power depends on its relentless forward momentum rather than comprehensiveness. This discipline distinguishes the theatrical cut from the extended versions that often dilute the impact of action films by indulging the filmmaker's reluctance to abandon any completed work regardless of its contribution to the overall experience. The presence of children among the passengers, though not foreground in the narrative, creates an undercurrent of additional stakes that operates beneath the principal drama, reminding audiences that the violence affects the most vulnerable travelers in ways the adult-focused plot does not explicitly address. Brief glimpses of terrified children clinging to parents, of small bodies being shielded from harm, of young voices crying in the background of combat sequences all contribute to the moral weight of the situation without requiring narrative detours that would dissipate tension. The film trusts audiences to understand the implications without spelling them out, respecting viewer intelligence while ensuring the full horror of the situation registers. The depiction of the bandits' economic motivations, however briefly sketched, grounds their criminality in recognizable material conditions rather than inherent evil, acknowledging that the desperation driving train robbery stems from the same inequality that allows first-class passengers to travel in comfort while others struggle for survival. This economic context does not excuse their violence, but explains it in terms that resist the comfortable demonization that allows audiences to enjoy their deaths without moral complication. The film's refusal to provide this comfort, its insistence on the humanity of those Amrit kills, transforms the action from cathartic spectacle into something more troubling and ultimately more honest about the nature of violence in conditions of extreme inequality. The relationship between the film's violence and the concept of karma operates as an implicit philosophical framework that would resonate differently for audiences familiar with Indian religious traditions than for those encountering the narrative from other cultural backgrounds. The chain of cause and effect that transforms a robbery into a massacre, that turns a soldier into a monster, that destroys both families aboard the train regardless of their moral standing, suggests a karmic understanding of violence as a force that consumes all who participate in it rather than distinguishing between righteous and unrighteous actors. Every death generates further deaths. Every act of vengeance provokes further vengeance, until the distinction between justice and atrocity dissolves into the simple recognition that violence breeds only more violence. The film's engagement with the psychological concept of moral injury, distinct from post-traumatic stress disorder, and increasingly recognized as a specific consequence of actions that violate deeply held ethical beliefs, provides a framework for understanding Amrit's deterioration beyond simple revenge narrative conventions. Moral injury occurs when individuals perpetrate, fail to prevent, or witness acts that transgress their core moral expectations, and Amrit's progression from protective soldier to vengeful killer represents a textbook case of this psychological phenomenon. His final hallucination suggests not merely grief, but the fragmentation of a psyche that can no longer reconcile its actions with its self-concept, a condition that no physical victory can ameliorate. The strategic use of darkness in the later sequences, as the train's electrical systems fail or are deliberately disabled, creates a horror-inflected atmosphere where threats become invisible and every shadow potentially conceals an attacker. This visual degradation parallels Amrit's moral descent, the world literally becoming darker as his actions carry him further from the ethical clarity he possessed at the film's beginning. The practical challenges of shooting combat in low-light conditions while maintaining spatial legibility required sophisticated coordination between cinematographer, gaffer, and choreographer, achieving the impression of near-total darkness while providing sufficient visual information for audiences to follow the action. The film's relationship to the Indian tradition of the angry young man archetype, popularized by Amitabh Bachchan in the 1970s and revived periodically since, offers a darker iteration that strips away the social justice motivations that characterized earlier versions. The classic angry young man fought against corrupt systems on behalf of the oppressed. Amrit fights purely for personal vengeance, his anger serving no larger purpose beyond retribution for his individual losses. This narrowing of scope from social to personal represents a generational shift in how Indian cinema conceptualizes righteous violence, reflecting perhaps a broader cultural loss of faith in collective solutions and the retreat into individual action as the only remaining response to injustice. The practical considerations of shooting extended action sequences within the confined spaces of a train set required innovative solutions from every department, as traditional camera positions became impossible and lighting equipment had to be concealed within the set's practical fixtures. The behind-the-scenes logistics of creating this film, largely invisible in the finished product, involved solving problems that would never arise on conventional soundstages or location shoots, the specificity of the setting demanding solutions unique to this production. These technical achievements, while not directly visible to audiences, underpin every frame of the finished film and deserve recognition as essential contributions to its artistic success. The film's treatment of female characters beyond Talika, particularly her younger sister Ahayana and her mother, avoids the complete marginalization that often characterizes action cinema's handling of women when the principal female character dies early in the narrative. These surviving women are not merely passive victims awaiting rescue, but active participants in their own survival, making decisions, taking risks, and experiencing the full range of emotional responses to catastrophe. Their presence ensures that the film's emotional landscape retains dimensions beyond the masculine cycle of violence and vengeance, even as that cycle dominates the narrative's foreground.